I was looking for you. I was not finding you.
Yeah, I'm not yet. Welcome to Portugal. Although online, it's a pleasure to have you here. Manuel, maybe you can do the honors and introduce Peter for us, please.
Oh, it will be my absolute pleasure to introduce Peter Felten to everyone. I'm just going to say a few things about what he's been doing in his academic life before I say a few things about why he's here and why we think it's a privilege to have him here. And he's the right man to be with us today. So Peter Felten is the executive director of the Center for Engaged Learning, which is one of the very exciting centers that there are in the world to support teaching and learning and to learn how to better do it. He's also Provost for Teaching and Learning and Professor of History at the Allen University in the United States. He works across institution about teaching and learning initiatives and also trying to learn about what works and what doesn't work, doing scholarship, which is very important. Teaching, Peter helps students to think critically and write about connections between lives of individual people and larger themes in history. He has published a number of books, a number of papers. The most recent book of him just published in 2020, it's 2020 if I'm not mistaken, is Relationship Education, How Human Connections Drive Success in College. So as you can see from this short introduction, Peter is interested and he has been studying and has been acting on improving teaching and learning in a higher education. And he has been doing that with a strong interest in people and how people connect and how people are agents of change and are also part of the change themselves. Peter is also known to me since 2018. He has visited Braga in those days. He was our keynote speaker in the CNAPS initiative, the National Initiative of Sharing Teaching in Higher Education. And he's a great person to have conversations with. And he is very generous. So he really said yes for the first time. And I must thank you, Peter. We all have a lot to do. I'm sure you have more than me. And so it's a privilege to have you there, to have you here with us at 6:30 in the morning, your time. So really, really fresh for you. And we agreed, and we agreed that we will not be having a talk from Peter, but we would have a conversation with Peter, because conversation makes the world go farther. And so without further words, I would like to welcome you, Peter, and give you the floor for your initial remarks.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Sandra, for having me. Thanks, everybody, for being here. It's a good reason to get up early on a Friday morning. And I wish I could be in Portugal. My family did have Portuguese food last night to celebrate my trip. It would be better in Braga, but it was good here in North Carolina. Manuel asked me just to say a couple words to begin. And so the first thing I want to say is that I'm on the different side of the Atlantic Ocean from you, in a different cultural context than you, in a different higher education system than you. So what I'm going to say is going to be from my own perspective, and I'm going to invite you to think about what does and doesn't make sense in your context. I don't want to presume that what I see from the US is what you see or what you experience where you are in Portugal. That said, I think this is a pretty extraordinary time to be talking about teaching and learning in higher education. I mean, the pandemic has changed almost everything in the US about teaching and learning in higher education, from the formats to where we teach, to how we teach. All sorts of things have changed. And the pandemic has had other really significant effects on society here, for example, magnifying social and economic inequities that already existed, that already shaped our classrooms. And so the pandemic has these practical effects on things like teaching through Zoom, but it also has really profound effects on faculty and students that I think we need, in my context at least, to be thinking about. So it's extraordinary at all to be thinking about teaching and learning right now, but maybe to be an optimist. Manuel encouraged me to be provocative, to use an American phrase, to look at the glass half full instead of the glass half empty. Maybe we have extraordinary opportunities right now to do creative things, to do significant change on teaching and learning in higher education, because everything has changed. We have to do things differently. So maybe this response that we're having right now to COVID has given us opportunity to break some long established structures, to change some of our practices that we just did, that students just did, that our institutions just took for granted. And so maybe we're in a liminal space right now where we can do things that in ordinary times would be exceptionally hard to do. So let me suggest 3 things that I think from my context are really interesting to be thinking about, and I hope might lead to long-term change in teaching and learning in higher education. One is, in the US at least, there's been this traditional distinction, this separation between the classroom and the world. You know, I teach history, and the idea is if I'm teaching history, what happens out there in the world has nothing to do with what's happening in my classroom. I don't know that that was ever true, but that is ridiculous to be thinking about in the context of a pandemic. And when I was teaching a history course last fall, even if I didn't bring it up, my students routinely would ask, how does this connect? You know, their questions, their concerns, their frame of reference was through the lens of what is happening now with these disruptions, right? So maybe there's a real opportunity to connect our classrooms and the world even more directly than we have before, our disciplines and our fields and the world even more than we have before. A second opportunity, I think, one that is particularly exciting to me, is that the traditional roles in teaching and learning of faculty and of students in higher education have been disrupted. You know, students no longer walk into my classroom, sit down, look at their phones until I begin to talk, and then just keep staring at me. I mean, the way we interact is different. The expectations that students have of themselves, that we have of them, have had to change. I was talking to a colleague in Switzerland a week or 2 ago, and she said, quite surprisingly to her, to me certainly, Swiss students are reporting being more happy and more engaged in higher education, teaching and learning than they were before the pandemic. And what they're saying is they have more agency, they have more choice, they have more control over what they do and when they do it in teaching and learning than they traditionally have. And so maybe there's an opportunity here for us to rethink what it means to be a professor, what it means to be a student in higher education in interesting and powerful ways. And then the last of my 3 ideas is that in the US, and my sense is perhaps in Portugal too, the practice of teaching in higher education has always been very individual. It's just me in my room with my students. And it's also been sort of informal. I just make this up as I go and see what works. There's an influential scholar in the US named Lee Shulman, who about 20 years ago wrote about pedagogical solitude. He said, we teach as if we're all alone, and we teach as if there's no knowledge out there in the world that could help us teach. And what COVID has really done, in the US at least, is prompted many new exchanges between faculty and students about how do you actually teach like this? And how do we do this together? And what happens if we cooperated rather than taught individually? And so I think there might be some interesting movement happening from teaching as an individual sport to a team sport, as it were. And teaching as a sort of an informal practice to teaching as an act of scholarship. So maybe we could talk some about those things, about how separations between people, between disciplines, between roles of students and faculty are changing because of the pandemic. And perhaps we can learn some things now from the pandemic that we can carry into the post-pandemic world whenever that happens to arrive.
Thank you, Peter. That was a great way to start our conversation. Everyone has left some questions for you, continuously in a platform that we opened at the beginning of this initiative. So what I was going to do with Sandra was going through like this 5 or 6, depends on how much time we have, most voted questions that were out there, and hopefully have some time for later on, people can participate and address those issues, those very interesting issues that you just raised. In the meanwhile, I could ask everyone, please, if you have any comments, anything to add to these specific 3 points that were just mentioned that we can get back to later in the session, and we'll be watching the chat for you, please leave them and write them down in the chat box, okay? So let's start with the predefined questions, let's put it this way. So taking all of what you said into consideration, taking that teacher might not be as solitary as it used to be, taking all the disruptive things that have happened, there must be like the single factor that can make an experience for students and teacher in higher education an excellent experience. Is there such a single factor? Which factor may that be?
Well, so it's a great question, and I wish there was a single factor. So I'm going to answer with 2 thoughts on this. The first thought is that I'm not sure there's a single factor, but I do think in the US, at least, the research is fairly clear that the most important factor in almost all of the outcomes we would want from higher education teaching and learning. So how much students learn, how much they can apply what they learn in their work and in their lives afterwards. In fact, how happy they are, how much well-being they have, how their sense of belonging in higher education. The single most important factor in all of those outcomes, based on US research, is the quality of the interactions, the quality of the relationships students have with faculty and with their other peers, with other students. So as you mentioned, Manuel, in your introduction, I have a colleague and I had a book come out recently called Relationship Rich Education. And what we're suggesting is that we need to think about how to make our classrooms, how to make our institutions places where students have really purposeful, really meaningful interactions with their peers and with faculty around questions and topics that matter. We can talk about how to do that in lots of ways, but I would say if there is a one answer, it's the quality of relationships. But I keep coming back to, and you hinted at this in your question, a talk I heard a decade ago by a really senior scholar in the US on higher education who said, you know, education research is sort of like medical research, that you find out that you have a particular illness, let's say, and there is a drug that can treat this, and it works in 75% of the patients. Well, you're pleased that it works in 75% of the patients and you take the drug. You don't really care at that point, though, whether it works in 75% of the patients. You care if it works for you. And so one of the key things to think about when we're drawing on education research or practices we learn from elsewhere is, does it work with my students? Because there might be ideas, there might be practices that seem very effective or research suggests are very effective, but if they don't work in your context, then they're not effective.
So Peter, what you're saying is that personalization is also a key factor here in significance of learning, right?
Yeah, so, it's essential. Thanks, Sandra.
Yeah. And do you think it's possible, I don't know if you approach this in your book, that this quality of interaction is it possible to remain when we go exclusively online?
Yes, but it takes us doing some hard work and thinking differently sometimes. So in the book, we interviewed 400 people from around the US, about 200 students and about 200 faculty at different institutions. And one of the institutions where we interviewed students and faculty is a fully online university. Okay. And one of the interesting things is this university actually there's a national survey of student engagement in the US, right? Which asks students a number of questions about the quality of things, including the quality of their interactions with faculty. This institution often scores higher than any other institution in the US on the quality of interactions. And what happens is that there that institution puts resources into not only in-class interactions, but they have writing coaches and writing tutors who speak with each student every week on the phone.
Wow.
Right? So every student has someone who calls them every week to talk for 15 minutes to say, how are your studies going? How's your work? What do you need? What kind of advice and guidance do you need to be successful in your work? That's an extraordinary.
Yeah. Are these peers or not?
Those are at this university, they're professionals.
Okay.
They're not the faculty teaching the course because there's too many students and not enough faculty. But they're trained professional writing. So typically they have a bachelor's degree.
Okay.
But you could do it with peers.
Yeah. I think this engagement approach is quite relevant because we're focusing mostly within teaching and learning, but the engagement with the university, with academia is a key factor for the engagement in classes as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you give us a hint? Can you give us a hint on institutions which are not so resourceful in terms, for example, in human resources?
Yeah.
Might address this current status in which we all have to teach without being prepared for that because we are presential, face-to-face people, and now we have to go online and do everything. And suddenly it's impossible to hire people because it's simply not the best economic moment, let's put it this way. So would you have any good examples or any hints that you could leave us to actually do better?
Yeah. Well, and again, I think culture matters a lot. So I'll give you a couple of examples, but they might or might not fit with Portuguese students and higher education. The first thing is that you have to recognize that there's a problem, that it's not just we're transferring what we did in the classroom to online. And so I think you have to say what is different here and what's possible because we have online space. So, or we're in online interactions. And I think there's formal things we can do and informal things we can do. The informal, a few interesting things that I know are working well here is, for example, asking students, well, first, something that a number of faculty are doing in the US that's interesting is when students show up in the Zoom room, the first thing they do, the professor says hello, and they put them in a small group into a breakout room with other students where there's a question or two. And often one of those questions is somewhat social, and one of those questions is related to the topic of the day. And so the first couple minutes students spend in class each day are in conversation with peers about something related to the class, right? That gets students turning their cameras on, it gets them talking to each other. Colleagues who are doing this have seen that students start showing up a little earlier rather than at the very last minute. And the professors who are doing this well, once the practice gets established, they've added things like they ask students what music should be playing in the room. And they ask students, what questions do you want to discuss? Right? And so and not every student in every class engages in these ways, but what you start doing is getting a critical mass of students who are having informal interactions with each other because they miss this too, right? We're not the only ones who are saying we don't get to have coffee with our friends. They don't either. So there's informal things. Then more formally, I think structured collaborative work to have students do can be very powerful. So breaking up lectures and having, again, small groups, whether they're in Zoom rooms or they're outside of class, the key in the US is that students have to understand that work actually counts in some ways. So is it graded? Maybe. Or is this the kind of question that's going to show up on the exam in 2 weeks? And so here's a hard exam question. Why don't you go into your Zoom rooms and try to work through this question together, and I'll give you 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and you'll be presenting, I'll call on one of the groups to present their solution to this very challenging question. And so students see the usefulness of having that group conversation because they want to do well on the exam. So it's not simply I'm just going to send you into Zoom rooms to chat now. Because in the US, that often doesn't work. The students are like, I don't want to talk to my peers about just anything. Does that help, Manuel?
I think it's interesting. I think it's quite interesting. And it sort of gives away the rigid structure that, you prepare everything, about all the conversation that are going on. And we know that works in classroom when we use interactive teaching techniques. So yeah, it sounds very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things we keep seeing is that going into the pandemic, a lot of American higher ed folks thought we needed all to be together all the time. So what we do is just like in the classroom, we go and then we're on Zoom all together. We don't actually need to all be together to watch the professor speak. That can be asynchronous, that can be recorded. What we need to be together for is to have interchanges with each other. And so recognizing, maybe making that together time a little precious. So it's less than the regular time, but it's very purposeful. So one last thing is breaking up big groups into smaller groups. So even if you're teaching a group of 50 or 100, if you're going to record lectures, then maybe you use class time to say, I'm going to meet for 10 minutes or 15 minutes with a group of 5 students to solve a problem. And I can't do that if I teach 100 students. I can't do that every day or every week, but maybe over the course of 2 weeks, I meet with each group once for 10 or 15 minutes. And then the students are really quite accountable in that 10 or 15 minutes. They get a lot of feedback. They get some good interactions, and it can be very powerful.
Yeah, I was looking at the second most voted questions. Do you foresee any changes in teaching and learning in higher education for the near future? And I was wondering whether that is one of them, because it's a dramatic change from what we have been doing. Would you select this as one of those changes?
I think it would. Yes, I think the pressure on technology and doing things quickly and at large scale is going to be very large. Mm-hmm. I also think some students sometimes will say, why do I have to come to campus? I used to go to campus because I had to go to campus. Now I can do class from home. So, or from my work or from the cafe or something like this. So I think we're going to have to be much more intentional about why we need to be together.
Yeah.
Rather than just everyone comes here to sit in a room to stare at the professor.
Absolutely. Yeah. What about the blended learning approach, and what do you think about that, given the current trends we are all looking at?
I used to be very skeptical of blended learning, but there was research done in the US. I can send Manuel a paper after this is done from Florida International University, a very large university in Miami that doesn't have a lot of resources, that has a lot of students, huge numbers of students, 50 or 60,000 students. And they did this really impressive study in introductory biology courses where they compared student learning, including student exam performance, on face-to-face classes, on fully online classes, and on these blended hybrid classes. And what they found is the students learned the most in structured blended classes. And what I mean by that is blended learning classes where when students were together, they were very active. So they were doing group work to understand and apply what they're learning in biology. And so in that case, they said we could take this was a 2 times a week traditional, 2 times a week lecture class. We could take one of those times and just turn it into video. And then take the other amount of time and make it very structured, required active learning, and the outcomes are much better. So I think one of the things maybe we could learn from this experience is how to use our time with students to be as productive as possible for their learning, and how and when we don't need to be together. when it's okay if they're watching a lecture of me talk about something in history, and then if they want to re-watch it, they can watch it again. They don't have to be in this space at this time in order to be passive. They need to be in this space at this time to be active.
Yeah. And have them as an active contributors for what we decide to do and how we decide to do it, right?
Exactly.
And I'm also assuming that that can somehow mitigate the feeling that students often have that they've been overwhelmed with work, because then you are taking away some time for doing something differently, as opposed to doing the same time and adding extra work and so on and so forth.
Yes. Yeah. There's a study out of Australia that I think is really interesting on this issue of students feeling overwhelmed and student well-being in general. And I think this is I'm glad you brought it up, Manuel. I think in the US, at least, it's a huge issue because there's so many pressures on everyone in the world right now. But for many of our students, they're fairly overwhelmed with life. And then they have all these academic things, and the academic things are unfamiliar. This study out of Australia, the University of Melbourne, asked thousands of students at the University of Melbourne what most contributed to their mental well-being as a student. And the answer overwhelmingly was the way faculty teach. Mm. And what they said is, and what the scholars say in this, is that faculty don't need to become counselors or therapists or anything else. Faculty need to recognize that students are human. And so, for example, as humans, they like interacting with other humans around things they find interesting. So how can you make your classroom a space where students feel like they're connected rather than they're alienated or disconnected? So I find that a really interesting study. So again, it's not students asking us to turn our classrooms into cafes or into therapy sessions, but us making our classroom spaces where they can be human.
Mm-hmm.
Seems simple, right?
It sounds simple, yes.
And the suggestions you gave before sort of point that to that direction. One of the questions that we had for you was coming later was exactly, what would you recommend to make institutions achieve a more humanized online learning environment? So you just touched it.
Yeah, one other thing that I learned, that just from my own experience, but this has been so powerful, really surprisingly powerful for me. So as you know, in the US, there's been a lot of racial violence and police-based racial violence. And so we've been thinking a lot about equity issues in our classrooms and all this. And one of the suggestions for the people who study this in the US has said is faculty should think about how we introduce ourselves to our students. And especially when it's online, so they don't get the sort of feel for how we are as humans. And so a suggestion that I learned in a workshop like this summer was to show an old family picture when you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your family. And so I did this with my history class this fall, and it was a 5-minute thing. And I have a picture. It's the only picture we have of my father before he was in his 20s. And it's when he was 3. He was raised on a farm, very poor, and it's his family. And so I said, that little person is my father, and a tiny bit about this. And, that was that, but it was just a different way of introducing myself. It took just a couple minutes. I didn't ask my students to do the same thing, but about 2/3 of my students over the next week sent me a picture from their family and said, this reminded me of whatever. And it was a really interesting way for us to get to know each other in a way like this, that, they wouldn't know anything except that I have a green wall in my dining room, and that's it. So small acts like that can just make ourselves human in ways that we're comfortable with our students. And, sometimes that'll connect with some of them.
Yeah, several asked about the fact that students keep their cameras off. Not only students, by the way, but students. But do you think that type of strategy would help to mitigate this problem? Or do you have any suggestions, other suggestions?
This is one of the issues that if we were, that would be one of the first questions that would come up in any faculty conversation in the US right now.
Yeah.
And there are very strong opinions in the US about this. Some people would say students should not have to turn their cameras on. Some of our students are in situations where they don't have strong internet, or they have family situations or whatever. So some people would say we should never require it. Honestly, I'm of the belief that we should try to make it purposeful and safe for them to turn their cameras on, so that they need to be on. Because if, I don't want this to sound wrong, but if all I'm doing is talking at them, then it's selfish for me to say, I need to see your faces, because I feel better than if I just see a blank screen. But if I'm talking with them, then I think it's reasonable for me to say, if possible, can you turn your camera on so we can all see each other's faces, right? So I have colleagues, for example, who will say to students, when you're in breakout rooms, you need to have your cameras on. When you're in the large group, you don't, right? But I really think it's a question of why do we need the cameras on? Why do they need the cameras on? And then how do we create an environment where they feel comfortable and safe with that? The one other thing that a wise colleague in a conference like this said to me said to a group in a couple of weeks ago that I thought was smart, was many of our students actually aren't as technologically sophisticated as we think they are. And so giving them a little guide to how to create a virtual Zoom background doesn't hurt, right? Because perhaps some of them don't like what's behind them, but don't know how to do what you're doing. So,
yeah. And if I may, Manuel, I would go to a related question. I think, they're all related, I would say. But one of the issues that commonly emerge is the issue of huge classes, classes with a large number of students. And we're talking about humanization and personalization in a way, and how can we do this with in classes with a great amount of number of students? I mean,
do you have any other questions? No, I think that's a really, really important and a really good question. So just maybe 4 ideas. One thing we can do, again, is recognize in a large class, the professor does have a role as something of a performer or a personality, right? And so can you bring your humanity into the classroom, which will make it safer and easier for students to feel like they can be human. Second, there's a wonderful study out of Arizona State University. In classes, the average class size in this study was above 250 students. And the study wanted to know if it mattered if professors used students' names in these classrooms. And what they found is, and this is before Zoom classes, this is face-to-face classes of 400 or 500. And what they found is it does. And the magic trick there was to do a name tent. So, have students fold over a piece of paper and write their name really big and have it in class all the time. And the authors of the study were surprised. They said they found this, but what happens is the professor could then either call a student by name, or they could say, I can't see your name, but can you tell me what your name is, right? And then they could say that, right? And the effects here didn't require the faculty member to actually know the student's name. What students needed to report is that they felt like the faculty member cared to know their name. And if the faculty member cared to know their name, the students reported doing more homework, being more likely to ask for academic help, and doing better on exams from caring to know their name. And then there's a side benefit. which this study found that they weren't even looking for, which is students started calling each other by name in a way that they didn't ordinarily. And so it felt more like a community. So second idea is just trying to use names as a very simple technique. A third is something that's increasingly popular in the United States and very, very effective is the term often used here is learning assistants. So these are undergraduates who are part of the class. They're hired to be part of the class. They're often students who did well in the past, and they're part of the class. And their job is to be present in class. So when students are doing small group work and things like this, the learning assistants can float among the groups and offer guidance and suggestions and support. You can do this virtually too. And you might say, we don't have any money for learning assistants. In the US, many institutions have tutoring centers and things like this. And the students who are hired in the tutoring center often sit there and don't do that much because no one comes to them. And so having the paid tutoring centers tutors show up in classes rather than just sit in the tutoring center can be an interesting way to adjust resources. And then the last thing I would say to make large small is there's very powerful research on collaborative testing that has students work and do quizzes and exams, partly individually, but partly in pre-established groups. And that collaborative testing leads all students to learn more. And I think finding ways as you can to build collaborative testing into your courses gives students, even in a large class, a small group that is their base, is their home group. And so they have a few students they're connected with and they're working with throughout the term.
And I think it's extremely relevant, and I would reinforce that you're mentioning studies, science, to support our choices. And I think we all need to be aware that there are really studies in this area. So we should base our practices in those data. Manuel?
Yes, and I would acknowledge further two things, which is the absolute care that you have in saying that what works over there might not work over here, because sometimes people try to look for a method and they try to fit it in their own context. And so you're being very careful about that. The other thing that I would like to acknowledge and connect it to what you just, one of the suggestions of the names that you just said, when you just mentioned that the glass is half full. Now we can see all students' names on Zoom. We don't even have to ask, well, I can't see your name, so it makes it in a way easier to go that way. So it's really important. And now let's go a little bit more to the collaborative testing. There are huge, of course, debates going on about assessing online and is it possible? Is it valid? Is it worthwhile? And one of the questions that we had was also about if you would have any suggestions that would be good at fostering intellectual curiosity of students. Now, the question was not about connecting assessment and intellectual curiosity, but I'm doing this mean thing of asking you the two together and see if you can make sense of them for us.
Yeah. Oh, it's a really good and really hard question. And so whenever I'm thinking about curiosity, my first reaction is John Dewey, who is an American philosopher from a century ago, had this really lovely line about curiosity and education. And he said, the problem with curiosity is more a problem of schools and teachers than it is a problem of students. That students and humans are curious. And unfortunately, students over time learn that school and classrooms are not places where they can enact their curiosity, right? So one of the things we have to do is nurture and spark the curiosity that's there already, right? So how to do that? I think for me, and I've actually, I did a project with a couple colleagues of trying to help our students become more curious over time. And so I did a lot of reading about curiosity. Again, I'm a historian, but I was curious. And the first thing that was really powerful for me was thinking about curiosity as a practice rather than curiosity as a personality trait. You know, that we might say in the US, you know, that's a very curious person, and not mean strange, mean someone who is curious all the time. And what psychologists have convinced me is that curiosity is a practice. In other words, and so people tend to be curious about some things, but not about others. You know, they're curious about why that football player is not as successful when he comes to my team as he was at the previous team, but they're not at all curious about how history works, right? And so people are capable of being curious, and we have to help them practice. So what do we do? I think part of this is explicitly naming curiosity as a goal. And having students, you know, saying to students, one of the things I want you to do is become more curious about the world or about chemistry or about whatever. I think a second thing we have to do is give students a chance to practice in ways that they can, well, in the US, we'd call them low stakes ways where they can be curious and they're not going to get in trouble for it, or they're not going to get penalized. A classic complaint from American students is that professors will say on an exam, you know, ask a critical question about something. And they ask a critical question, and the faculty member says, that's not the right question, right? So how do we give them time to be curious and to, you know, to ask silly questions or stupid questions or off-topic questions, but they're practicing being curious, and then give them feedback and say, you know, Peter, that was a really interesting question. It wasn't a history question, but it was a really interesting question, so that they become reflective too, and they start thinking about, you know, what am I curious about? So
give positive reinforcement for asking questions independently of the nature of the questions, right?
Yeah, and perhaps even saying not just that's a good question, but here's why that was a good question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And to continue the topic, and maybe, I don't know, making it a little harder, is online assessment that values curiosity and is fair.
Mm-hmm.
Is that possible?
Well, I think I'm curious what you mean by fair.
Okay.
But I think because curiosity is a practice, we should treat it like you would other practices, where the key is that you can do it over time. So I would be more likely to want to ask my students if, you know, so if I'm teaching a history course, and one of my goals is to have students become more curious about certain aspects of American history, I would want them to do regular writing, you know, a couple times a week, where they just think about something that they're curious about in the past and write about it a little bit. And then I would ask them for an assessment to turn in, you know, 6 or 8 of those writings, and with maybe a short essay saying, okay, so looking across these 6 or 8 times where I wrote about moments when I was curious about history, this is what I think about curiosity in history. And then I would assess that essay, right? Rather than putting an exam question on saying, be curious right now about this one thing. I think that's an inauthentic task.
Thank you. Sandra, shall I go on or shall you?
I didn't hear you, sorry.
I was asking if I should go on.
Yeah, you can.
There's a question about the other side of the world, the dark side, the negative part of the glass.
Mm-hmm.
So do you foresee, because you're offering, of course, from research, from your experience, from your knowledge, suggestions and hints to address negative, let's put it this way, consequences of quickly having to learn how to do things differently, but being positive.
Mm-hmm.
Would there be any negative things that are here to stay, that they will be very difficult to address?
Mm-hmm.
And how shall we prepare ourselves to mitigate them a little bit, avoid them?
So let me mention three things. And the first one, I'm not sure we can dig into more if you want, but I'm not sure how to address it exactly. But in the US, at least, what we're seeing is that some students just aren't showing up in higher education who ordinarily would. And those tend to be first in family students to go to college. They tend to be low income students. They're just not coming to school anymore. And so as and that has huge negative outcomes for their lives, but for our society and all this. So one of the questions that I think we really need to think about, but it's probably beyond me as an individual professor in a classroom, is how do we make our institutions accessible and meaningful and appealing to low-income members of our community? That's a hard and systemic thing. The two more practical faculty folks facing negative things. One is I'm quite concerned that's what's going to come out of the pandemic is people thinking there's a technological solution to everything we're trying to do. And what we need to do is just get better technology. And, so maybe Zoom wasn't perfect, so we need an even better online tool. And I'm very concerned in the US, there's this assumption, plus there's these huge companies, Google and Microsoft and all this, who are saying, here is the technological solution to this teaching problem. And I think that we have that backwards. And so one of the things we have to really be vigilant about and really be pushing hard on is that these are learning problems. These are teaching and learning problems that might have technological solutions, but they're not technology problems that solve teaching and learning issues, because in the US, there's a huge amount of industry right now trying to sell universities products to fix teaching and learning problems. And I think that's exactly backwards. And then the other is in the US, again, there is this sense that what university education should be is small, discrete, stackable chunks of things, right? So you take this course here, and then maybe later you take that course here, and you just stack them up as if they're all separate. And you create, and you get what you need from them by stacking these little things up. And if that's all a university education is, I think we in higher education have failed, because what a university education really needs to be is holistic and integrated, right? So that it matters that a student takes Sandra's course and Manuel's course and my course, in sequence together, so that they can see how the themes and the topics or the skills that Sandra was helping the students develop further in Manuel's course, and then even more in mine. I think if we chop up higher education into little bits and pieces and then treat them as if they're all completely independent, we're doing our students a huge disservice, because that's not how the world works and that's not how learning works. And we're also going to destroy higher education institutions, because Microsoft will sell the most popular ones of those little chunks for very little money. And universities like yours or mine will have to only do the boutique, high-end, specialized ones that are very expensive, and it won't work. So we have to make education holistic, and we have to make it human rather than technological and separate.
And it's an important balance we need to consider, because the digitalization of all the higher education system is a big issue nowadays. So I think we shouldn't miss this focus on trying to make it balanced, right?
Yeah, and Sandra, I appreciate you saying that. And one really helpful thing that some colleagues have written in the US is that we shouldn't also think that technology is always wrong or technology is always bad in this case. A very silly example, but one of the things I've learned from the pandemic is that if a student wants to meet with me one-on-one, we can do that in Zoom much more efficiently than them coming to campus, coming to my office, waiting till I'm available. one reason why that a lot of students don't come to talk to me is because it takes them an hour to have a 5-minute conversation with me. So maybe we can do some things better with technology that will allow all of us to use our time differently, right? So it's not that technology is by definition bad. It is just not the solution to every question.
Yeah. Would you have any recommendations for our institutions on actions we can organize out of the curriculum that would help for this balance to take place?
Can you say a little
For
more?
example, I was previously I was talking about peer work in several dimensions. Do you have anything in place at your university or others you know that we could try to foresee here as well?
Yeah, there's so two broad ideas. One is thinking about peer mentoring models and peer mentoring resources. One of the things in the book that Manuel mentioned about relationship-rich education that we saw in a lot of institutions where we interviewed is when there are peer programs to support students, let's say within a particular discipline or with a particular identity, such as immigrant students or things like this, those peer mentors become the most important students most important people in those students' success, right? So if you have a large program or even a small program, how can you create peer mentoring where upper level students in your program welcome lower level students in, help them navigate things a little bit, help them think through the work and help them feel like they belong. So these sorts of peer programs can be really powerful. What was another one? I guess I would just say I'd start with peer programs.
Yeah, because well-being is really the foundation so that everything else works, right?
Yeah. The research in the US is very powerful around the term that's often used here is a sense of belonging. And so if a student feels like they belong in physics at the University of Minot, they behave in certain ways. So if they feel like they belong, they then are comfortable going and asking a tutor or a professor for help when they're struggling.
Sure.
They're comfortable asking questions in class. If they're not sure if they belong, they're less likely to ask for help, right? And that's so bad because what that means is the students who are in the most precarious situations are the least likely to ask for help. And so what we need to do is help students feel like they belong. The research is also very clear that there's simple, small things we can do, like use students' names, like connecting newer students up with older students or more experienced students, partly just to see that you can make it through these things. One of the really powerful lessons, both in the research and we saw in our interviews, is when you talk to newer students about the peers that help them, what the newer students say is the peers proved that it was possible that you could make it through this. So I want to be like them, right? And they're not that different than me because they often look at faculty and say, you're so different than me, even if actually 20 years ago I was just like them. They don't see that, right? Or I wasn't even as academically successful as they are, but that's okay. They don't see that. So they can see that in their peers. And so helping peer-to-peer connections develop can be really key. And there's a lot more peers. There's a lot more students. So again, all the relationships don't have to run through faculty because we already have too much to do.
Thanks, Peter. There's a question. There's a couple of questions popping out at the YouTube channel. One of which is probably relates to many people which are in this room, which is, of course, what about time if you have to do research and if the research is what most counts in your life?
Yes, welcome to higher education. I think what we want to do is Well, first recognize that we're all human, and so we have to build systems that account for our well-being too, right? And we can't think of effective teaching in higher education as something that destroys people's careers or destroys people's lives, right? That can't be effective teaching. Effective teaching has to be something that you can be a human, that you can be successful. I think a lot of what we're talking about with paying close attention to teaching and learning can end up freeing up faculty time a little bit, right? So if you have stronger peer groups or you have learning assistants who are helping students be successful in your classes, there's time you have to put in upfront to develop those ways of teaching, to train learning assistants and all this. But that can free up time later for students to be successful. So I think sometimes there's a bit of a trade-off we might have to give. We're giving up a little time now to buy time later. One other thing, which is in our scholarship, in our areas of, in our research, we would never just say, you know what, I don't know anything about how to do this, so I'll just make something up and see if it works, right? What we would do is we would say, okay, so what's the literature say? What's the scholarship out there say? And so I think we can work with colleagues to identify scholarship in teaching and learning that can be helpful for us, that again can be time saving. So if we're thinking about humanizing online classes and trying to create effective groups in online classes, there's quite a lot that's been written about how to do that well. And so rather than me spending weeks and weeks trying to figure out how to do it, if I read an article or two, I'm maybe 2/3 of the way there, and then I can be more efficient in my course planning than if I have to invent everything myself.
Yeah, as you, I'm sure Manuel mentioned this to you earlier, that we're trying to create these communities of practice in our own institutions and in this type of interinstitutional approaches. Do you have recommendations for us so that we do things better and together?
First, I'm so glad you're doing this. And the research, the international research on how teaching improves in higher education, how teaching changes in higher education, really strongly emphasizes the value of conversations among colleagues who trust each other. So, you know, workshops or events like this can be helpful, but what really leads to sustained change is small communities of practice of people, let's say, all teaching introductory chemistry, saying, how do we do this together, right? So find your people and talk to your people and help each other, right? I think there's that. And then drawing on the research and the expertise of your colleagues so that you, again, we're not having to invent everything on our own.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I think this was great and of great value. But Manuel, you may want to say something else.
Absolutely, Peter.
Yeah.
We try to give the most prevalent questions of everyone. So we tried to make it for efficiency reasons. That's why we didn't ask people to stand up and do the questions themselves, so we could ask a bit more. So apologies for this being just me, Sandra, and Peter to everyone. But this was an extraordinary session. 60 minutes elapsed so quickly. And so I cannot thank you enough for being here so thoughtfully with us. And because you left us such an interesting opening remarks, I would just ask you if you would like to leave a quick final remark before we close.
So two things. One, I'll send Manuel some of the papers I mentioned. That maybe one of them will be useful to you or interesting or a place to start. And the other is, in some ways, back to that question of time and question of the various pressures on faculty. And I think we all do what we do because we want to make a difference in our students and in our communities. And so one of the ways that you can sustain yourself as an effective teacher in higher education is seeing the positive results. And so we can end up having a reinforcing cycle here where, I try something, it works fairly well. My students are a little more engaged. I feel even better about my teaching. And so I'm willing to put that time in to keep working on it. But we're never going to get this perfect. That's one of the things that I think is shared between our research and our teaching, is that these are impossible questions to solve. And once we think we solved it, and we find out that we haven't. So I'm taking that curiosity and that sort of scholarly mind to your teaching. In the long term, I think will help you be more successful and happier, perhaps too. So thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. In the name of everyone, I'm sure that was really thoughtful for everyone. And more than that, it helps us to have some hints, and it helps us to reflect in different ways. We need people to come up and talk to us about the same things in a different perspective from a different country, to actually help us think a little further and perhaps clearer and perhaps better. And you've done this amazingly. So I cannot thank you enough. I hope we can see you soon sometime.
My
and
pleasure.
in Aveiro, you need to come to Aveiro. I've been in Braga, you need to come to Aveiro.
I would
the next
love
time.
that more than you know. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Take care.
Peter, take care.
Bye-bye.